Singapore was designed to defeat one enemy, a naval attack from the south. Its coastal batteries were monsters. The 15-inch guns at Buona Vista and Johor Battery could throw a 1-ton shell 20 miles. On paper, no fleet on Earth could survive within range, but those guns pointed out to sea. Behind them to the north lay the Malayan Peninsula, 400 miles of jungle, rubber plantations, and river crossings. British planners had declared it impassable to a modern army. That assumption would kill the Empire's Asian dominion. Facing Singapore was Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, a career staff officer, thin, tall, with a nervous mustache and a reputation for competence in planning rooms. He had 85,000 men under his command. The 9th and 11th Indian Divisions of Lieutenant General Sir Lewis Heath's III Indian Corps, the 8th Australian Division under Major General Gordon Bennett, and the fresh British 18th Division just arrived from England. On paper, an overwhelming force. Opposite him at the Thai border on December 8, 1941, the same night as Pearl Harbor, stood General Tomoyuki Yamashita and the Japanese 25th Army. 3 divisions, the Imperial Guards, the 5th and the 18th, roughly 30,000 combat troops. Yamashita called them his Tiger Army. They had studied jungle warfare for a year. They rode bicycles. They carried light mortars. And they had precisely one order: take Singapore in 100 days. Yamashita would do it in 70. Within 72 hours of landing at Kota Bharu, the Japanese sank the pride of the Royal Navy. On December 10, 1941, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were caught without air cover off Kuantan by land-based bombers of the Japanese 22nd Air Flotilla. Both battleships went to the bottom. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips went down with his ship. In one afternoon, British sea power in Asia ceased to exist. But here is what the history books often leave out: the greater disaster was already being written on land. For the next 8 weeks, Yamashita conducted one of the most brilliant campaigns in modern military history. Every time Percival established a defensive line, the Jitra Line, the Slim River, Kuala Lumpur, Johor, Yamashita flanked it. His infantry pedaled around British roadblocks on bicycles bought in bulk from Japanese hardware stores. When rubber trees blocked motor traffic, the bicycles kept going. When bridges were blown, engineers threw pontoons across in hours. By January 31, 1942, the last British troops, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, pipers playing Heelan Laddie, crossed the Johor-Singapore Causeway. Behind them, the Royal Engineers detonated 70 feet of the causeway into the strait. Singapore was now an island under siege, and here is where General Arthur Percival made the decision that doomed his army. He had to defend 70 miles of coastline with 85,000 men. Logic said the Japanese would attack across the narrowest stretch, the northwest near Sarembun, where the strait was barely 1,000 yards wide. Every reconnaissance report screamed it. Japanese artillery was moving into position opposite that exact sector. Signals intelligence was intercepting shipping movements to matching landing sites. If this is landing, save this video. You will want to come back to this one. Percival ignored it all. He convinced himself Yamashita would attack in the northeast, near the naval base and the reservoirs, where the terrain favored a set-piece assault. So he placed his strongest formation, the fresh, well-armed 18th British Division under Major General Merton Beckwith-Smith, in the northeast, and he assigned the vulnerable 40-mile northwest sector to the 8th Australian Division under Gordon Bennett, a formation already gutted from the Malayan retreat, with the Australian 22nd Brigade under Brigadier Harold Taylor stretched across 20 miles of mangrove swamp. Taylor had 3,000 men to cover ground that required 15,000. His forward companies were separated by up to a mile of jungle. There was no barbed wire, no coordinated searchlights, and on Percival's direct order, no scorched earth destruction of the oil tanks at Kranji. The fires might damage civilian morale. At 10:30 p.m. on February 8, 1942, Yamashita's artillery opened fire. 400 guns concentrated on Taylor's 20-mile front. Within an hour, telephone lines were shredded. Then the assault craft came out of the darkness, 4,000 men of the Japanese 5th and 18th Divisions in the first wave alone. They landed exactly where Percival had refused to reinforce. The Australians fought. Machine gunners of the 220th Battalion held their positions until they were bayoneted at their posts, but there was no cohesive line to hold. By dawn, 13,000 Japanese were ashore. By nightfall on February 9th, 23,000. Percival, still convinced the northeast attack was coming, refused to release the 18th Division reserves for 2 full days. By February 11th, Yamashita held roughly a third of Singapore Island, but he had a secret. His men were running out of everything. His artillery ammunition was down to 100 rounds per gun. His infantry was on emergency rations. His entire operation was one hard British counterattack away from catastrophe. Yamashita later admitted in a 1946 interrogation, and I quote from the transcript held at the National Archives, "My attack on Singapore was a bluff that worked. I had 30,000 men and was outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. I knew that if I had to fight long for Singapore, I would be defeated." Percival did not know this. What he saw was chaos. Japanese aircraft flew unopposed. The Bukit Timah Heights fell on February 11th. The Mac Ritchie and Pearce reservoirs, Singapore's water supply, were captured on February 13th. 1 million civilians packed the streets of the central city. Cholera loomed. On February 13th, Yamashita sent a message dropped from an aircraft, a demand for unconditional surrender, signed with the flourish of a man who knew his enemy was cracking. It was pure theater. He did not have the shells to enforce it. On February 15th at 9:30 in the morning, Percival called his senior commanders to the Fort Canning bunker. The room is still there, preserved as a museum. Heath urged surrender. Bennett wanted to counterattack. The staff argued for 2 hours. At 11:30, Percival made his decision. He would ask for terms. At 5:15 p.m., he walked under a white flag and a Union Jack up the road to the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah. Yamashita, sitting behind a plain wooden table, refused to negotiate. He hammered the table and demanded a yes or no. "Yes," Percival said quietly. 85,000 British, Australian, Indian, and Malay soldiers laid down their weapons. It remains the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. Yamashita told his own staff that evening, "I was afraid the British would discover our numerical weakness. Their surrender was a miracle." The consequences ran far beyond Singapore. Within weeks, Japan occupied Java, Sumatra, Burma, and the Philippines. 900,000 square miles of Allied territory changed hands, but the deeper wound was psychological. For centuries, the British Raj had rested on a single assumption, that European military power was unassailable in Asia. On February 15, 1942, that assumption died at a wooden table in a car factory. The prisoners paid a terrible price. Of the 85,000 who surrendered, more than 16,000 would die in Japanese captivity, worked to death on the Burma Railway, starved in Changi prison, or drowned in the hell ships of 1944. Percival himself spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Manchuria, guarded by a small detail while emperors and generals debated whether he was a scapegoat or a fool. The truth is harder. Percival was not incompetent. His plan for Malaya, filed in 1937, had actually predicted the exact Japanese line of attack. But he was overpromoted, under-resourced, and worst of all, locked into a defensive philosophy that could not adjust when the assumptions collapsed. Churchill had ordered him to hold to the last man. Instead, he surrendered the largest field army Britain ever fielded in Asia. His decision that morning almost certainly saved 100,000 civilian lives. It also ended the British Empire east of Suez. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote in his diary on hearing the news, "We are paying very heavily now for failing to face the insurance premiums essential for security of an empire." Churchill wanted a public inquiry. His war cabinet buried it. The full report on the disposition of forces at Sarembun was not declassified until 1993. Yamashita went home a hero. He became known as the Tiger of Malaya. He would be hanged in Manila in 1946 for war crimes committed by troops he did not directly command in the Philippines, a controversial verdict that established the doctrine of command responsibility still cited in international law today. And the great 15-inch guns of Singapore. They fired only a handful of rounds inland, mostly with armor-piercing shells useless against infantry. When the surrender came, most were still pointing out to sea, guarding the ocean from an attack that never came. CTA 1213 Min. If you want more battles where one decision changed an empire, where the numbers on paper meant nothing against the man who read the ground, subscribe to WarDossier and hit the bell icon. New battle every Wednesday. Drop in the comments, do you think Percival made the right call at 11:30 that morning, or should he have counterattacked with the 18th Division while Yamashita was still bluffing? I read every comment, and this one is going to spark a fight. Outro 1315 Min. The fall of Singapore is not a story about weakness. It is a story about certainty. Percival was certain the attack would come in the northeast. His planners were certain the fortress could hold 60 days. Churchill was certain the empire could not fall. Yamashita's greatest weapon was not his infantry or his artillery. It was his willingness to bet everything on the enemy believing what he wanted him to believe. Every fortress that has ever fallen has fallen the same way, not to a stronger army, but to a commander who stopped questioning his own map. That is the lesson of Singapore. And if this one hit, my next video takes you to the jungle where Yamashita first perfected the art of the bluff, the Battle of Slim River, where 500 Japanese tanks and infantry shattered 2 entire Indian brigades in one 12-hour night. It is one of the most extraordinary armored assaults of the entire war, and almost nobody talks about it. That drops next Wednesday. See you then. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops to General Tomoyuki Yamashita at the Ford Motor Factory in Singapore, the largest capitulation in British military history. But Yamashita's 25th Army was outnumbered nearly 3-1, nearly out of ammunition, and one hard counterattack away from disaster. So how did Britain's Gibraltar of the East fall in just 7 days? This is the full story of the fall of Singapore, the disposition of forces that doomed the Australian 22nd Brigade at Sarimbun, the bluff that broke Percival's nerve, and the aftermath that ended the British Empire in Asia. Timestamps: 00:00 the bluff that took Singapore 00, 35 the fortress that faced the wrong way 03, 00 the decision that broke the line 06, 00 the bluff that won the Empire 09, 00 the legacy that broke an Empire 12, 00 subscribe and comment 13, 00 the lesson of Singapore sources. British National Archives WO 172, Yamashita Interrogation Transcripts 1946, Percival's Official Dispatch, Declassified 1993. New military history every Wednesday. Subscribe and hit the bell.